Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its golden light over the turquoise waters of Bora. The lagoon stretched out before James Porter, the quiet, rhythmic lap of the waves against the shore, a constant, calming companion. He stood at the edge of the sand, his eyes scanning the horizon. It was the perfect day for a tour. The weather was ideal, the water clear, and his group of tourists was ready. James had been an eco-tour guide for over a decade now, leading kayaking tours through the crystal-clear waters of the South Pacific. He knew the area like the back of his hand. Its vibrant coral reefs, the schools of brightly colored fish, and the rare sightings of stingrays and sharks. Today, though, something felt off. A vague, uneasy tension prickled at the back of his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. He'd been doing this long enough to know that days like these, when the air was still and the sea quiet, were often the most dangerous. "All right, everyone," James called, clapping his hands together as the group gathered around. "Let's get started. Safety briefing first." He smiled warmly, his voice carrying a calm confidence as he spoke. Most of the group, a mixture of young couples and a few older tourists, were excited, but a bit anxious about the idea of kayaking out into the open water. He could tell by the way they fidgeted with their paddles and the life jackets they adjusted for the fifth time. "We'll be paddling out to the reef today, just a short distance from the shore. The water is shallow, and you'll be able to see the reef beneath us. Now, the most important thing to remember is that you stay together as a group. Keep close to me at all times, and if you feel uncomfortable or get tired, just signal me, and we'll head back. Also," he added, glancing at a couple of the younger tourists who seemed more interested in taking selfies than paying attention, "no sudden movements in the water. We don't want to startle anything." "Got it, James." A woman with blonde hair and a wide grin said. She gave him a thumbs up. Her name was Emily, and she was part of a honeymooning couple. James had already noted that they were both nervous but excited. "All right," James continued, "let's grab our kayaks and head out." The kayaks were arranged in a neat line on the shore, their vibrant colors a stark contrast against the white sand. James checked the equipment quickly, paddles, life jackets, and the first aid kits, before motioning for everyone to pick their kayaks. Emily and her husband, Mark, chose a double kayak near the front, while a few others opted for singles. James took his own, a sturdy, well-worn kayak he'd used for years. With the kayaks in the water, James led the group out toward the lagoon. He didn't speak much as they paddled, allowing the sound of the water and the distant call of seabirds to fill the air. It was a peaceful, almost meditative experience. The kind of day tourists came to Bora to experience. The water was as clear as glass, and the gentle motion of the kayaks seemed to make everything else fade away. As they moved further out, James kept an eye on the group, ensuring they were all sticking together. The shallow reef wasn't far ahead, and he knew it was where most of the excitement would come from. Snorkeling with fish, watching stingrays glide effortlessly across the sandy bottom, and if they were lucky, maybe spotting a shark or two. "Keep paddling, we're almost there," James called, his voice carrying over the water. He felt a familiar rush of anticipation. Most people didn't get to experience the reef in this way, from the vantage point of a kayak, with no other boats around. The water was so clear that they could already see the outline of the reef beneath them. Fish darted past, some as small as the palm of his hand, others bigger than a football. The sun overhead gleamed, casting rays of light through the water that made the whole world shimmer. "Isn't it beautiful?" Emily said, her voice full of awe. Mark nodded beside her, his eyes scanning the water. "Yeah, it's amazing," Mark replied, though his voice sounded a bit tense. James could tell he was still getting used to the open water. They continued for a few more minutes, paddling in, near silence as the group spread out slightly, but always within sight of one another. The closer they got to the reef, the more James's eyes moved back and forth, instinctively watching for any changes in the water. The feeling in his gut hadn't gone away, the one that told him something was just off. It was then that James noticed the first odd sign. A slight disturbance in the water, a ripple that spread out in a perfect, almost unnatural arc. It wasn't the kind of movement that came from the gentle stirring of fish or a wave breaking against the shore. This was something deliberate, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Hey, James," Emily called again, breaking his focus. "Is that a—" James turned, following her gaze. A shadow had moved beneath the surface, but it was too large to be just a school of fish. His heart rate quickened. The shape was long and wide, with a peculiar silhouette he immediately recognized. It was too big to be anything else. "Everyone stay calm," he called out, his voice more measured than he felt. "Just keep paddling, don't make any sudden moves. I'm going to keep an eye on it." The shadow disappeared beneath the water, but James wasn't fooled. He'd seen enough sharks in his time out here to recognize their behavior. Hammerheads, especially, were known to be curious creatures, often venturing into shallow waters. The one thing that had kept most tourists safe was that the sharks usually weren't interested in anything larger than a fish. But this one was different. "James?" Emily's voice had an edge of concern now. Mark was looking over at him, his face pale. "Just keep paddling," James repeated, his eyes scanning the water. The shadow was still there, circling. Beneath them. It hadn't disappeared. Suddenly, a burst of water erupted beside them. James's body tensed as he saw the fin, a long, triangular dorsal fin slicing through the surface of the water. The shark was close. Too close. "Move!" "Paddling." "Hard now!" James shouted, panic creeping into his voice. He had to get them moving before the shark lost its interest in the reef and turned toward them. But it was already too late. The shark shot forward, its mouth wide open, its eyes fixed on the kayak, directly ahead of James. In one swift movement, it struck, slamming into the side of the kayak with such force that it overturned completely. The sound of splintering wood and the rush of water filled the air. "No!" Emily screamed as she was thrown into the water, and Mark's terrified voice followed, "Emily, Emily!" James's heart leapt into his throat as he tried to process what was happening. The shark circled back, its body undulating with eerie precision, and James had a single horrifying thought before everything else drowned out. "They're not safe. Get back to the shore." He shouted at the others, paddling furiously toward the overturned kayaks. "Get back now!" The tension in the air thickened as James watched the dorsal fin slice through the water, leaving behind a small trail of foam that seemed to expand with each second. His heart rate quickened, and his eyes darted from the fin to the calm faces of the tourists behind him. They had no idea how close they were to danger, and that was something James desperately needed to fix. Everyone. "Paddle now!" he shouted, his voice urgent and sharp. The group, startled by the sudden command, hesitated for a moment, their paddles still and their eyes wide as they looked toward the water where the fin had just disappeared beneath the surface. But it was already too late. The shark had already detected their presence, and it wasn't turning back. "Paddle," James repeated, his voice even more insistent this time. He shoved his own paddle into the water, moving quickly and efficiently, trying to create distance between the group. "Hands the looming threat." "What's going on, James?" Emily called out, her voice cracking with uncertainty. The excitement that had been present in her voice earlier was gone, replaced by sheer panic. James kept his eyes fixed on the spot where he had last seen the fin, his muscles tense as he paddled harder. "It's a hammerhead. Stay close to me." "Paddle now and harder." Mark's voice came next, distant and panicked. "Should we turn back to shore? Is it safe out here?" James didn't answer right away. His thoughts raced. Turning back to shore wasn't an option. Not yet. If they did that now, they risked being scattered. It was better to stay together and keep moving, even though every instinct in his body told him that he should be doing the exact opposite, heading straight back to the shore as fast as possible. "Listen to me." James called back to the group, forcing his voice to sound steady even as his own hands were trembling. "I need you to stay calm. We're not turning back. Not yet. Just keep paddling, stay close to me, and don't make any quick movements. If you do, it could provoke it." He could hear Emily's shaky breath through the radio, the terror evident even in the way she inhaled. "I don't know if I can do this, James. I'm so scared." "You're doing fine," James said, trying to reassure her. though it felt hollow in his own chest. Just keep paddling, don't stop. The water around them was eerily calm. The typical splashes from the kayaks cutting through the water were all but muted now, replaced by the faintest sound of the wind as it tugged at the surface. James's mind was racing, but he forced himself to stay focused. The hammerhead shark was likely circling, sizing them up, but there was no telling how long it would remain interested. Hammerheads didn't typically attack humans unless provoked, but that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Far from it. Their jaws were powerful enough to inflict serious damage. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke through the silence, the unmistakable sound of something large and heavy breaking through the water. It wasn't the typical splash of a fish or a ray. This was something else entirely. "James, look out!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. Before James could turn around, the water exploded beside him, a massive splash showering his kayak. He barely had time to react as the force of the attack knocked him sideways. His kayak rocked violently, the whole structure tilting dangerously to one side. The shark had struck. Its wide, hammer-like head appeared next to his kayak, its mouth gaping open in a terrifying display of rows of razor-sharp teeth. The hammerhead was large, larger than any he'd encountered before. "Go! Go!" James shouted, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. His kayak was now upside down, and he barely managed to keep his grip on it as the shark circled beneath him. He could hear the chaos behind him, Emily crying out in fear, Mark shouting something about trying to turn back. But James had no time to help them now. His focus was entirely on staying afloat. His legs flailed beneath the water, the cold salt water biting at his skin, but the kayak wasn't staying upright. The shark had struck with a precision that left him little time to think. It moved in fast, its massive body almost brushing against his overturned kayak. He could hear the sound of its gills pulsing through the water, each one like a slow, deliberate breath. His mind raced as the shark came around again, clearly drawn to the motion. "Don't panic," James called back to the group. He had no idea if they could hear him. He was too caught up in the fight for survival to worry about anything else. His only priority now was keeping himself alive. Keep together, keep paddling. But the reality of the situation began to settle in. No one had the energy to paddle effectively in this situation. Another massive splash, closer this time, pushed his kayak even further, sending James sliding off the side. He kicked frantically, trying to regain control, but the shark's movements were swift. It made a sudden sharp turn, its body now fully exposed just under the water. James's breath caught in his throat as the creature closed in, its mouth snapping in a way that made his stomach drop. Just as the shark moved in for another pass, James's instincts took over. He kicked harder, trying to move toward the only safety he could see. A buoy on the horizon. It was far, but it was a chance. "James, it's too far, don't—" Emily's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by the splashing of paddles, the panic in her voice escalating. James didn't have time to reply. The hammerhead's form darted below the water again, and in the split second that followed, he saw the familiar shape of the dorsal fin moving closer. The group was scattered now. There were no longer any coordinated paddling, no safety in numbers. Everyone was in survival mode, each person trying to stay afloat. James knew they needed rescue, fast. But rescue at that moment felt like a distant, unreachable dream. Just as the shark rose once more, its massive shadow overtaking James's view, he saw a glimmer of hope, a small boat moving at a speed toward them. The engine roared louder with each passing second, and with it, a sense of relief. "Help over here!" James shouted, his voice raw as he fought to stay afloat. His heart pounded in his chest as the boat neared, its bright orange hull cutting through the water. He kicked toward it with everything he had left, his breath ragged, the water now burning cold against his limbs. The boat pulled alongside them, and James reached out, his hand trembling as he grabbed the side. "Help! Pull me up!" He felt his body lifting, the hands of the rescuers gripping him firmly. They hauled him aboard, the shark still circling, its shadow barely visible beneath the water. "Is everyone else all right?" James managed to gasp as he was pulled to safety. "Stay still, we've got you," one of the rescuers said, a calm but urgent voice. But as the boat sped away from the attack zone, James looked back toward the lagoon. The Hammerhead had disappeared into the depths, leaving behind only ripples in the water. It was over, for now. But James knew he would never forget what had just happened. The sound of the boat engine grew louder, but it seemed to take an eternity to reach them. James's heart hammered in his chest as he kicked his legs harder, each stroke more desperate than the last. The shark was still circling, but now it was slower, more deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment before it went in for the kill. His body felt numb from the cold, but his mind was a blur of adrenaline. He could hear the others in the distance, their cries and shouts ringing in the air. He hoped they were moving, hoping they were paddling away from the danger, but his eyes remained fixed on the shark, his attention divided between the looming predator and the approaching rescue. "Help! Please help!" James shouted, his voice barely above a strained rasp. He could barely hear his own words over the pounding of his heart and the rush of the water. His mouth was dry, his breathing ragged, but he kept his focus, refusing to let his panic fully take over. The shark was still there. He had no time for fear. The boat was closer now. Through the blur of his exhaustion, James could make out the shape of the crew, 2 men, both shouting directions to each other. The boat was small, probably a local fisherman's vessel, not built for speed or rescue, but it was all they had. James's eyes locked onto it as if it were his only lifeline. The shark, however, had other plans. With a sudden burst of speed, it surged upward beneath James's kayak again, its broad hammer-shaped head breaking the surface of the water. He saw it in full now, the glint of its eyes, the jagged edges of its teeth, and the terrifying weight of its presence. The shark's body twisted and lunged with terrifying precision, its powerful tail sending waves in all directions. "No!" James screamed, his legs kicking frantically as he struggled to stay clear of the shark's path. His hands found the sides of the kayak, but it was slipping away from him with every movement. His grip tightened, his knuckles white, but the water was too turbulent now. The shark darted below him again, vanishing into the depths, but James knew it wouldn't be long before it reappeared. It had already taken one shot. The next time it could strike harder. His mind raced as the boat drew closer, but it still seemed impossibly far. His muscles burned with the effort, and the reality of his situation began to set in. His legs felt like lead, and his arms were sore from struggling to stay afloat. He had been in the water too long, and exhaustion was taking its toll. The coldness of the lagoon seeped into his bones, the weight of the water dragging him down. He was starting to lose focus, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. "Stay with me, James," a voice shouted from the boat. It was one of the rescuers. James barely recognized it, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "Keep kicking! We're almost there!" James wanted to respond, wanted to reassure the man that he was trying, but his breath was too shallow. His chest felt like it was caving in under the pressure of the cold water and the weight of fear. The shark had disappeared again, but it was still there, just under the surface, its shadow moving with lethal grace. The boat lurched as it reached him, and the rescuers threw a rope toward James. His arms felt like they could barely move, but he forced them to act, grabbing the rope with both hands. He was yanked forward, the motion sudden and rough, but it was enough. The boat had him. The rope burned through his palms, but he didn't care. He was almost there. "Get him in. Get him in now!" one of the rescuers shouted. Hands reached down, grabbing his shoulders, pulling him toward the side of the boat. But as they did, the water behind him erupted once again, a violent splash that sent chills down his spine. James turned his head just in time to see the shark's dorsal fin slicing through the water behind him, moving faster than before. It was closing in. With all the strength he had left, he kicked his legs one more time, trying to propel himself toward the boat. "Hurry up! Get him up!" the second rescuer shouted, his voice filled with panic now. The urgency was palpable, and James could feel the hands on his back shoving harder, pulling him upward. And then, with a final, powerful tug, they managed to hoist him into the boat, just as the Hammerhead lunged again. James's body was half in, half out of the boat, his legs dangling over the edge as the shark swam beneath them, so close that he could feel the water stir around him. He barely had time to register it, his senses overwhelmed by the near miss. Before the rescuers pulled him the rest of the way inside, James collapsed onto the cold, hard surface of the boat, gasping for air. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, his body shaking uncontrollably from shock and exhaustion. He could hear the other tourists shouting now, their voices distant, muffled by the rushing blood in his ears. The boat was moving quickly away from the spot where the shark had been, but he couldn't focus on anything except the fact that he was no longer in the water. "You okay?" The first rescuer, a man in his 30s with short, dark hair, leaned over James, his eyes searching for any signs of injury. His hands were steady, though James could see the tension in his face. "We got you, you're safe now." James's throat was dry and he struggled to find his voice. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He nodded weakly, trying to get control of his breathing. His entire body ached, his limbs sore from the fight to stay afloat. But the worst of it was the terror gnawing at his insides. The fear, the raw panic of being so close to death had not left him. It still clung to him like a heavy weight. "Are the others okay?" he managed to croak, his eyes darting toward the others. He could still see them in the distance, their kayaks scattered across the lagoon, paddling furiously toward the shore. James's stomach churned at the thought of what could have happened if they hadn't reached him in time. "We've got them. They're all right," the rescuer reassured him, though the concern in his eyes betrayed his words. "But you, James, you're hurt. We need to get you to the hospital." James nodded weakly, his mind still reeling from the encounter. He could feel the cold from the water seeping into his bones, but it wasn't the physical chill that was paralyzing him. It was the memory of the shark, the sharp, predatory focus of the creature as it circled him, sizing him up. It had been too close. "Thank you," James whispered, barely audible over the roar of the engine. His eyes closed for a moment as the boat sped toward the shore, the only thing keeping him tethered to the present moment. The shark was gone now, but the terror it left behind was something James knew would haunt him for a long time. The boat moved steadily toward the shore, but James felt as though the distance between him and safety was measured in miles rather than meters. Every wave felt like it would drag him back under. Every thrum of the engine was a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. His hands shook uncontrollably as he clutched the side of the boat, his chest tight, the terror still gripping his insides like an iron vice. "Are you sure they're all right?" James rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to look at the others. His mind was too consumed with the horror he had just endured. The feel of the shark circling beneath him, its massive, predatory eyes, focused on him, would never leave his memory. He knew it. The trauma had etched itself deep into his brain and there was no escaping it. "They're fine, man," the rescuer, David, replied, his voice steady but firm. David's face was still taut with concern, but he gave James a reassuring look. "The others were a little shaken, but they're getting to shore with the guide boat. You're the priority right now." James tried to nod, though his neck felt stiff. His body was bruised from the strain, but it wasn't the physical pain that was consuming him. It was the emotional toll. His heart pounded, each beat a reminder that he had narrowly escaped death. The sight of the hammerhead shark circling beneath him was seared into his mind, a relentless, horrifying image he couldn't shake. "What happened?" James asked, his throat tight. He needed answers. How had the shark gotten so close? He knew they were in shark territory, but this was beyond anything he had ever anticipated. Hammerheads weren't typically aggressive toward humans. What had triggered the attack? David glanced at him, his brow furrowing as if deciding how much to say. "It's hard to say. The area you were in isn't known for this kind of behavior. Hammerheads usually stick to deeper waters, and they don't usually attack unless they feel threatened or confused. You may have startled it." James let out a shaky breath, his mind still trying to comprehend what had happened. Threatened? There had been nothing to provoke it, at least not from his side. It had come out of nowhere, as if the shark had simply decided that it was time to hunt. And what about the others? Had the shark been targeting him specifically, or was the group just unlucky? "What happens now?" James muttered, mostly to himself. He knew they couldn't stay on the boat forever, but he wasn't sure he could face the shore either. His body wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear, but that wasn't an option. David turned his head, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll get you checked by the medics as soon as we're back. You'll be all right." The others are heading in too, and we'll make sure they're all safe. The real danger's past, but you're going to need some time to process what happened." James wanted to believe him, but something inside him told him that the real danger was far from over. The shark had attacked once, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't return. The water beneath him felt like a trap, the calm surface deceiving. It was still possible for the shark to circle back, to strike again, even though they were moving farther from the lagoon. Every inch of his body was on high alert, his senses hyper-aware of every small shift in the boat's motion, every ripple in the water. Suddenly his mind flashed back to the moment when the shark had first attacked, the way the water had parted around it, the silent menace that had followed. It hadn't been a feeding frenzy. It hadn't been an angry attack. It had been calculated. The shark had decided to go after them. But why? Was it hunger? Was it territorial? Or had it simply been in the mood for a challenge? "We've got you, man," David said again, his voice softening. But the weight of the situation still felt heavy in the air. James could hear the engine of the boat sputter slightly, the crewmen at the helm adjusting their course toward the nearest dock. The lagoon was becoming smaller behind them, the shore now clearly visible in the distance. The minutes stretched on as if time itself had slowed. James could hear the distant shouts of the others who had been on the tour, their voices raised, in confusion and fear. Some were crying, some were silent, but all of them were undoubtedly shaken to their core. But in that moment, none of their voices reached him. His mind was too wrapped up in the vivid images that played in his head, of the shark's eyes, the way its body moved, how it had circled so calmly, so predatory. David finally broke the silence. "James, I'm sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through right now, but we've got to keep it together. You'll be all right. You're going to make it. You hear me?" James nodded again, his gaze still distant. He didn't feel like himself. There was something that had shifted in him. That fear, that primal sense of survival, it hadn't faded. It had only deepened. And now it was more than just fear of the ocean. It was a fear that ran deeper, one that gnawed at his soul. I don't know if I'll ever get back in the water again," James confessed, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure why he was saying it. The words had just come out of his mouth, but they felt true, deeply, scarily true. "I've been on the water my whole life. But what I saw, what happened." David didn't interrupt. He just nodded, his face grim. "It changes you, I get it. It's hard to process something like this, but you've got to give yourself time. You survived something most people never will. You'll find a way to work through it." James didn't know if that was true. He didn't know if he'd ever be able to see the water the same way again. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the shark. Every time he heard the sound of splashing, his heart skipped a beat. The terror had rooted itself in him, a permanent part of his psyche. The boat crept closer to the shore, and James could see the small crowd gathering near the dock. Some were people from the tour, others were locals. He could hear their murmurs, their concern, as the boat slowly approached the wooden pier. One of the tourists, a woman in her 30s, was standing at the edge, waving her arms frantically. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She must have been one of the ones who had seen the shark. As the boat neared the dock, the panic in the air grew. James felt a wave of nausea hit him as the boat gently bumped against the wooden planks. He could hear the sound of it creaking, the splash of water as the boat was pulled to a halt. "Come on," David urged gently, helping James to his feet. "We're getting you to the medics. They're waiting for you." James staggered slightly, still weak from the ordeal, his body aching and trembling. But as he stepped off the boat and onto the dock, he was met by a paramedic team, their faces set in the calm professionalism that came with years of experience. They immediately took his vitals, checking for signs of shock, but James barely noticed them. His mind was still on the water, on the shark. "Are the others all right?" James asked, his voice thick. His thoughts returned to the others on the tour, wondering if they were safe, wondering how they were handling the terror that had been thrust upon them. "They're safe. Everyone is accounted for." "One of the medics answered, his tone gentle but firm. "But we need to get you checked. We'll talk about everything else in a bit, all right?" James nodded numbly, his thoughts scattered. His heart was still racing, but he felt the weight of something heavier settle in his chest, something that had little to do with physical injury, something that would follow him long after the bruises faded, and the nightmare became a distant memory. The boat's hull scraped against the dock as it slowed to a stop, the engine sputtering to silence. James could feel the rush of movement around him as the rescuers worked quickly, securing the boat and preparing to help the others. The air was thick with tension, and his thoughts were jumbled, spinning in circles. The reality of what had just happened was still hard to digest. Wasn't sure how long they had been out there, but it felt like a lifetime. "James," David's voice broke through his fog. "We're here. Can you walk?" James nodded weakly, though his body felt as if it had turned to stone. Every muscle screamed for rest, for peace, for the ability to stop feeling the weight of the ocean's terror pressing on him. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to face anyone. The thought of seeing the others, of facing the people he had been guiding just hours before, made his stomach turn. The rescuers helped him out of the boat, their hands firm as they guided him toward the dock. As he stepped onto the solid wood, his legs wobbled beneath him, and he had to clutch onto David for balance. His body wasn't prepared for solid ground. It was still in a state of disorientation from the trauma of the water. He had barely realized it until now, but his legs had become weak and shaky from the shock of what had happened. "Take it slow," David advised, his grip tight but not overbearing. "We're almost there. Let's get you checked out." James didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to say anything. He just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on forcing his body to keep moving. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the weight of the entire experience was pulling him down, keeping him from feeling any sense of normality. The dock was busy, locals rushing to help with the boat, while others, likely other tourists, gathered around to look at what had happened. Some had already seen the damage, the kayaks overturned, abandoned. Some of them must have known the group was in danger, but none of that mattered now. James felt like a ghost in the middle of a world that was still turning, still functioning. While he was stuck, trapped in a moment he couldn't escape. David guided him toward a small building near the edge of the dock, where a medic was waiting. The medic was a woman in her 40s, with short brown hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She didn't waste time asking questions. She just moved immediately to assess James's condition. "Sit down," she instructed firmly, guiding him toward a chair. "I need to check you out." James didn't argue. His body felt like it was made of lead, and he slumped into the seat, grateful for the moment of stillness. The medic began her assessment, checking his pulse, his breathing, and the numerous cuts and bruises that dotted his skin from the impact of the kayak capsizing and the violent struggle in the water. "You've got some scrapes and bruises, nothing major," she said, her eyes never leaving her task. "But I'm more concerned about the shock you're in. Your vitals are fine, but you need rest." James could hear the words, but they didn't seem to mean anything. Shock. Rest. It was as if his mind couldn't process them properly. All he could think about was the shark, the image of that massive, looming creature beneath the water, the way it had circled him, the way he had known. It was there, just waiting for the perfect moment. David was standing nearby, talking to some of the other rescuers, making sure the others in the group were safe. The tourists were being brought in one by one into the small building, each of them looking just as shaken as James. Some of them had tears in their eyes, others were still in shock, but all of them shared the same look of fear and disbelief. Finally, one of the other tourists approached James. It was a woman, probably in her early 30s, with blonde hair that had been pulled back into a messy bun. Her eyes were wide, her skin pale, and she looked as though she had been holding herself together by sheer will. "James," she said softly, stepping forward. Her voice trembled. "Are you okay? You were the one with the kayak, weren't you?" James looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. He knew her face, recognized her from the group. Her name was Claire, but everything felt distant now. The world around him seemed blurry, out of focus. The only thing that was clear was the image of the shark, the way it had moved through the water so effortlessly. It had been predatory, methodical. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice rough. I'm fine." But even as the words left his mouth, he didn't believe them. He wasn't fine, none of them were. Just need a minute." Claire nodded slowly, her expression full of sympathy and concern. But there was something else in her eyes too. Fear. It wasn't just for him, it was for herself, for the others. They had all seen the same thing, felt the same terror. The shark hadn't just attacked James. It had attacked the idea of safety, of control, of certainty, and that was something none of them would ever get back. I can't believe it," Claire said softly, her voice cracking. "I've been on kayaks before, I've been in the water before, but this, it was like it came out of nowhere. It didn't even seem real." "It wasn't," James whispered. He could barely hear himself speak, his mind too fogged by the trauma of the attack. But the words spilled out anyway. "I don't know why it came for us. It didn't make sense." Claire sat down next to him, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I just keep thinking about it. How close we were. If you hadn't been there." James closed his eyes at the thought. If he hadn't been there. The if-are was a constant in his mind. It wasn't just for Claire, it was for everyone. What if the shark had come after them instead? What if he hadn't been able to get back on the boat? The weight of it all was unbearable. He could hear the sounds of voices in the background, but they were fading into the distance now. It felt as though he was trapped in a vacuum, surrounded by chaos, but completely disconnected from it. The only thing that existed was the attack, the shark, the water, the helplessness. "I need a drink," James muttered, barely aware of his words, but Claire heard him and nodded. She reached for a bottle of water, uncapping it and handing it to him. He drank deeply, the cold water feeling like ice against his parched throat. The sensation was oddly grounding, but it didn't chase away the pounding in his head. He needed to think, to process what had happened, but it wasn't coming together. Nothing made sense. Just then, David returned, his face grim. "James," he said, voice low, "we've reported the incident to the authorities. They'll be taking statements, but I wanted to tell you that we've already contacted the local maritime patrol. The shark won't be a threat for much longer." James looked up at him, the words sinking in, but they didn't make him feel any better. The shark had been so close, so dangerously close. And now, even though they were safe, James felt as though he had escaped only physically. His mind, his emotions were still caught in the water, with the shadow of the shark still looming. The medics had taken the time to clean James up and check his injuries, but it wasn't his cuts and bruises that worried him most. It was the gnawing, suffocating feeling in his chest. The panic that had taken hold of him in the water wasn't something that would go away with a bandage or an ice pack. He could still feel it deep inside, a constant tension. His body had endured the physical toll, but his mind was still in the water. David had been talking to the group for a while now, trying to calm them down, make sure everyone was okay. But it wasn't just the survivors that needed help. James could sense that David, too, was barely holding it together. His face was tight with strain, his hands clenched at his sides as he paced back and forth, occasionally glancing in James's direction. Claire had stayed close by, her face pale but determined. She seemed to want to say something to him, anything, but the words never came. Instead, she just sat across from him, hands wringing in her lap, staring at the floor as if trying to escape the memory of what had happened. James could see the raw fear in her eyes every time she glanced at him. She wasn't the only one. "What happens now?" James finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. His voice sounded foreign to him, rough and hoarse. It was the first time he'd spoken in what felt like hours, but the words were necessary, even if they sounded weak. He needed to know what came next, to understand what was happening to him, to them. David, who had been standing near the door, turned slowly. "What do you mean?" James lifted his eyes, meeting his friend's gaze. "What happens now with the shark, with the investigation, the others? Is the tour cancelled? Is everyone okay?" David sighed deeply, the weight of the question visible on his face. He was avoiding the worst part, the part that James had been too afraid to ask, the part that had kept him up at night ever since he'd stepped onto this damn boat. "The shark's gone, James," David said quietly, almost as if trying to convince himself. "We haven't seen it since it attacked. No sign of it coming back." James clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the last remnants of panic start to build again. But what if it does? The thought of the shark appearing again was too much to bear. The whole day had been a nightmare, but the idea of that shark returning to finish what it had started, it was a terror he couldn't escape. David looked at him with a hard expression. It's unlikely. It was probably just a mistake. A territorial reaction. They don't usually hunt in shallow water like that. It wasn't looking for a fight. James's mind screamed otherwise. The shark had been calm, deliberate, like it had known exactly what it was doing. The sudden violence, the way it had flipped the kayak over and attacked with such precision, wasn't something he could write off as a mistake. It didn't feel like a mistake, James muttered under his breath. He barely recognized the words as his own. It knew what it was doing. It was hunting, and it didn't stop. David was silent for a moment, his expression hardening. We'll file a report, get the local authorities involved. They'll handle it from here. James wanted to ask more, but the words didn't come. His chest was tight, the terror rising again like a wave. What if it wasn't over? What if there were more sharks, lurking just beyond the edge of the bay? What if the attack was only the beginning? Claire shifted in her seat, her voice breaking the silence. I don't want to go back out there. I don't think I can. Her words were soft, but they carried a weight. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for the others too. Everyone in the group was affected. James knew that, even if they hadn't admitted it yet. David turned to face her. No one is going back out on the water today. We'll have to adjust the schedule, get the group back to safety. I'll make sure everyone's accounted for. Claire nodded, her face still drained. She was trying to be strong, but James could see the cracks in her resolve. They were all struggling, each in their own way. The medic approached then, her expression softer than before. James, I know you're shaken up. We've got a team coming in to take statements from the group, and I need to know if you're up for it. You're going to have to answer questions about what happened. James froze. The idea of talking about it, of reliving the horror, was enough to make his stomach churn. But he knew it was something he had to do. If he didn't speak up, if he didn't help with the investigation, then he'd be left with nothing but his own fears, and that wasn't going to help anyone. Not him, not Claire, not anyone. I can do it, James said, his voice sounding hollow. But I don't know if I'll be any help. I'm not sure I remember everything. You remember more than you think, the medic said, her voice gentle but firm. Just tell them what happened. It'll help. James didn't respond. He couldn't find the words. The next few hours passed in a blur. James found himself answering questions, recounting the attack with as much clarity as he could muster. The local authorities had arrived by boat and conducted a search of the area. They had pulled the kayaks from the water and taken statements from the other tourists. It all felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. But in the back of his mind, there was the constant hum of fear, the dread that wouldn't go away. The shark had attacked, and it had left its mark on them all. As the day wore on, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving James with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. His mind still swirled with the terror of what had happened, but his body was starting to shut down. He was left with a crushing sense of helplessness that clung to him like a second skin. The questions didn't stop. The investigations didn't stop. People kept asking him about the shark's movements, about what he had seen in the water, about how he had managed to escape. But all he could do was remember the feeling of the kayak flipping, the water rushing around him, the cold, predatory eyes of the Hammerhead. Every answer felt inadequate. Nothing could change what had happened. He sat down on a bench near the building, staring out at the ocean. The sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in warm oranges and pinks, but the sight didn't soothe him. All he could think about was the water, the deep, dark water. James? Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. She had come over, standing just in front of him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She looked as lost as he felt. You okay? James didn't know how to answer. He wasn't okay, but he couldn't say it. Not now, not in front of her, not in front of anyone. I don't know, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I'll ever be. Okay. Claire's eyes softened and she sat down next to him. You're not alone in this, okay? None of us are. She didn't say anything else, just sat there with him, letting the silence stretch on, offering him the kind of comfort he didn't know he needed. The sun had dipped beneath the horizon by the time James found himself sitting on the edge of the dock, his feet dangling over the water. The cold breeze that had once felt refreshing now seemed cruel. The ocean stretched out in front of him, dark and vast, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing boat. He couldn't shake the image of the shark from his mind. It was all he could see, even in the dimming light. The dark, hulking figure beneath the waves, its eyes fixed on him. He closed his eyes, trying to push it away, but it was no use. It was as if the ocean had branded him, and there was no escaping it. "James?" David's voice broke through the stillness, and James turned to see his friend standing a few feet away, his expression guarded but concerned. "You okay?" James didn't immediately respond. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain how every time he closed his eyes he saw that shark, its cold, unblinking gaze staring back at him. He couldn't make sense of it. Nothing about it made sense. David took a few steps closer, his shoes scraping softly against the dock. "You haven't said much since we got back. I'm worried, man. We all are." "I'm fine," James muttered, his voice hoarse and distant. "Just need some time." David didn't buy it. He sat down beside James, leaning back on his hands and staring out at the water. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now, comfortable, familiar. David had always known when James needed space, but also when to sit close. Without saying anything. "You think it's over?" David asked quietly, his eyes still fixed on the water. James shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think it is." David didn't respond right away. The sound of the waves seemed louder now, crashing against the shore with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality. But James couldn't escape the images that flashed behind his eyelids every time he blinked. The shark wasn't done. He could feel it, deep inside him. That thing hadn't left. Not really. He could still hear the water churning, feel the coldness of the ocean wrapping around him as it had that day. David exhaled sharply. "The authorities say it's just a one-off thing. The shark probably thought your kayak was a seal or something." "Bullshit," James said, his voice sharper than he intended. His fists clenched involuntarily. "That wasn't just a mistake. The way it circled me, the way it attacked, that wasn't a mistake." David flinched at the harshness in James's tone, but didn't pull away. "I know you're scared. We all are. But you're not thinking straight, man." James stood up abruptly, his legs unsteady as he tried to regain his balance. His hands gripped the edge of the dock, his knuckles white from the tension. "You don't get it, David. You weren't there. It wasn't just some random shark. It was hunting. It knew what it was doing. I swear I felt like it was testing me, waiting for the right moment." David stood up too, taking a cautious step toward him. "James, calm down, man. We're safe now. It's over." "Is it?" James shot back, his voice rising. "Is it really over? You think I'll just forget about it? You think I'll just go back to normal?" He took a step away from David, pacing now, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stop moving. His thoughts were a mess, and his body followed suit, restless, unwilling to sit still. "You think I'll just get in another kayak tomorrow and pretend that this didn't happen?" David didn't answer at first, but his face softened. "I'm not saying it didn't happen, James. I'm saying that we can't keep letting it control us. We can't let it define everything." James ran his hands through his hair, frustrated, shaking his head. "You don't understand, David. It's not just about the attack, it's about what it means. The way I felt in the water, the way I thought it was over, but it wasn't. I'm never going to feel safe again, not out there." David didn't respond for a long time. He stepped closer to James, his hand on his shoulder. "I can't pretend to know what you're going through, man, but you can't let this thing break you. You've always been the one who helps everyone else. Now it's time for you to get help too." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his words sink in. He had always been the guide, the one who had the answers, who was calm in the face of fear. He had helped others find their way when they were lost. But now he was the one lost in the fear. He was the one who couldn't find his way out of it. The irony of it made him feel even more isolated. "I don't know if I can do it anymore," he whispered, the words barely audible. He wasn't sure if he meant being a guide or just being himself, being anything. He felt as though the attack had stripped something vital from him, something that could never be replaced. David's hand squeezed his shoulder firmly. "You don't have to do it alone, James. You've got people who care about you. You've got me. We're going to get through this, man, but you've got to talk about it. You have to talk about it." James felt a surge of emotion rising up inside him, and before he knew it, his voice broke. "I'm so fucking scared, David. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make it stop." David's voice softened. "You don't have to fix it right away. It's going to take time, and that's okay, but you're not alone. You don't have to go through this by yourself." James let out a shaky breath, his chest tight as he fought to regain some sense of control. He felt the sting of tears at the back of his eyes, but he fought them back. He didn't want to break down. Not here. Not now. For a moment, the two of them stood there, looking out over the water. The stars were starting to appear, distant pinpricks of light against the dark sky. It was beautiful in a way, the calm that had settled in after the chaos. But for James, it wasn't enough to drown out the noise in his mind. It wasn't enough to erase the terror that still clawed at him from the depths. "Are you going to stay here tonight?" David asked, breaking the silence. James shook his head slowly. "I don't think I can. I don't think I can stay here. Not yet. I need to keep moving." David nodded slowly. "All right, just don't go off by yourself. Get some rest, okay? You can't outrun it forever." James gave him a small, empty nod. "I'll be all right." David gave him a final pat on the back before turning to walk back toward the group. James watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. As James stood there alone, his heart heavy with everything that had happened, the only thing that seemed to make sense was the vast expanse of water in front of him, the same water that had tried to claim him, the same water that had taken so much from him. He couldn't forget it. He wasn't sure he ever would, and for the first time, he understood that the shark hadn't just attacked his body. It had attacked his mind, too. It had left a mark on him that no amount of time or distance would erase. The water lapped gently at the dock below him, and James felt a deep, quiet unease settle in his chest. "It's not over," he thought, "not by a long shot." The days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty. The hotel room had become a cocoon, a place where James could hide from the world, yet also a cage that held his thoughts prisoner. The terror still lingered, clawing at him, even when he was awake. Every time he stepped near water, the waves seemed to swell with the memory of the shark's cold, calculating gaze. David had been checking in on him daily, but the conversations felt strained. Each one was a reminder that the world had moved on. But James hadn't. He couldn't. Not after what had happened. He hadn't been back to the water. The thought of stepping into the ocean again, of getting near another kayak, made him sick to his stomach. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment the shark had flipped his kayak, saw the way the water had exploded in front of him as its jaws snapped shut with terrifying precision. He could still feel the pressure of its presence, like a shadow stalking him in his waking life. But then, one afternoon, as James sat staring out of the hotel room window, there was a knock on the door. His heart sank. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for another round of questions, another reminder of what had happened. He rose slowly and opened the door, half expecting a stranger, some official, or even the hotel manager. But it was Claire. She stood there, her face a mixture of concern and determination, as if she had been waiting for him to finally answer the door. "James," she said softly, her voice laced with sympathy, "I need to talk to you." He glanced at her, the weight of the moment pressing in. He didn't know if he was ready to face her. The guilt of what had happened, the others, the attack, everything hung heavy between them. He had seen the fear in her eyes that day, and it haunted him more than the shark's attack itself. He didn't want to drag her into his mess, but he knew she wasn't going to let him hide forever. "Come in," he said, stepping back to let her through. She entered the room quietly, glancing around at the dimly lit space before turning to face him. Claire took a deep breath, her eyes unwavering. "For you can't keep running from this, James. I know you're hurting. I know what happened scared you, but I also know that you're stronger than this." Her words weren't accusatory. They were firm, but gentle, as if she were trying to coax him out of a dark place. "I don't feel strong," James muttered, sinking into the chair near the window. "I feel broken." She shook her head, sitting down opposite him, her expression softening. That's not true. You're not broken. You just need to confront it. You can't stay in here forever. You need to face what happened. James looked at her then, really looked at her. Her brown eyes were full of empathy, but there was something else too, something that made him feel both vulnerable and understood at the same time. It was the look of someone who knew what it was like, to be scared and yet still take a step forward. I can't go back out there, he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. I can't go near the water again, not after what happened. Claire leaned forward, her voice low but steady. James, I get it. I do. You don't have to go out there tomorrow, or even next week. But you can't let fear dictate your life. The shark, it wasn't personal, it was just doing what sharks do and it won't come back. The authorities are certain of that. But if you don't face this, if you don't take that step, it will follow you everywhere. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. James ran a hand through his hair, trying to process her words, trying to make sense of the storm that was still raging inside him. He didn't know how to fight it, the fear, the anxiety, the crushing weight of it all. It wasn't just the memory of the shark. It was the feeling of being helpless, of not being able to protect himself, let alone anyone else. What if it happens again? His voice cracked, betraying the rawness of his emotions. What if I'm out there and something worse happens? What if I don't survive next time? Claire's gaze softened and she placed a hand on his arm. You survived the first time, James. That's what matters. That shark is gone and you're still here. Don't let the fear win. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. We can face it together. James swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. He felt small, vulnerable. He had always been the one who kept it together, the one people looked to for reassurance. But now he was lost. The attack had torn away the confidence he had in the water, the trust he had in himself. It had stripped away the armor he'd worn for so long, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. I don't know if I can do it, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to go back out there. I don't know if I ever will. Claire's hand squeezed his arm, her voice firm but kind. You don't have to know right now, but you will. You're stronger than you realize, James. You just have to take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched on, but this time it wasn't as suffocating. There was a sense of calm that settled over him, even as the storm raged inside. He looked at Claire, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I don't deserve your help, but I appreciate it more than you know. Claire smiled softly, her eyes warm. You don't have to deserve it, James. You just have to let me be here for you. He nodded, feeling the weight in his chest lift just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. He didn't have to face this alone. He didn't have to do it all at once. As she stood up to leave, Claire hesitated for a moment before turning back to him. One more thing, you don't have to rush back to the water, but when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be there with you. James sat there in the quiet room long after she had gone, the stillness offering him a strange sense of peace. The road ahead was long and he didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in days he felt the possibility of recovery. Maybe he wasn't broken. Maybe he just needed time to heal. He stood up and walked over to the window, gazing out at the darkened ocean. It was calm now, peaceful even, but he knew that it would take time before he could look at it and not feel the shadow of the shark looming over him. But he also knew deep down that he wasn't going to let the fear control him forever. One step at a time, that's all he could do. One step at a time. James had never known what it was like to feel the weight of his own fear so acutely. It had been weeks since the shark attack, weeks of trying to force himself to move forward, only to be pulled back every time by the suffocating grip of anxiety. Claire's words had stayed with him, but they didn't make the fear go away. They didn't erase the feeling of helplessness that seemed to cling to him, heavier with each passing day. Still, he knew he couldn't stay in the hotel room forever. The decision to step back into the world hadn't come easily. Even after all that had happened, after everything he'd felt, he knew that if he didn't face the ocean again, he would never be able to fully move on. It wasn't about being brave. It was about survival. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that had been shattered. But that didn't make it any easier. The day had come, and there was no turning back. James stood on the edge of the dock, staring out at the same water that had once felt like a place of wonder, a place of calm. Now it felt alien. He could still see the ripple of the water, feel the cool breeze brushing against his skin, but everything felt different. Dangerous. His hands were shaking, and his chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough air. Okay. David's voice cut through the silence, and James turned to see him walking down the pier toward him. He was dressed in a light shirt and shorts, clearly ready for the water, but his expression was tight, the concern evident. "I don't know," James admitted, his voice quieter than usual. He wanted to say more, but the words caught in his throat. The anxiety was overwhelming, a tidal wave of tension that left him paralyzed. David stopped beside him, looking out at the water. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The gentle slapping of the waves against the dock was the only sound between them. "Let's just take it slow," David said finally, breaking the silence. "No pressure. We'll just get in the kayak, paddle around a little, and you can see how you feel. No rush. You can stop whenever you want." James nodded, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little. David's calm demeanor was grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this. That made it a little easier, though it didn't take away the lump in his throat or the pounding of his heart. David turned to walk toward the small kayak, and James hesitated for a moment before following. The steps felt heavy, as though each one carried a weight that was almost too much to bear. He could still hear the snap of the shark's jaws, feel the pressure of the water as he'd fought to stay afloat after the kayak had flipped. It wasn't something that could be easily erased. "James," David called from the kayak. "You in?" James swallowed, took a deep breath, and nodded, stepping into the boat. It wobbled slightly under his weight, and for a second, he thought, about bailing, about walking away. But that thought was quickly banished as he looked over at David, who was already settling into his own kayak, a reassuring look on his face. "Let's just paddle out a little," David said, his voice easygoing as if they were just two friends going for a leisurely row. James tried to keep his movement steady, but his hands gripped the paddle a little, too tightly, his knuckles turning white as he pushed through the water. His body felt tense, every muscle straining as though the water itself was a threat. For the first few minutes it was quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic splashing of the paddles against the water. The boat swayed gently, the light breeze carrying the scent of salt and the faint whisper of distant waves crashing against the shore. "You're doing fine," David said, glancing over at him. "How are you feeling?" James glanced at him, then back at the water. His mind raced, but he couldn't quite pin down the feeling that was gnawing at him. There was something primal about it, something deep within, that made him want to turn back. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean was watching, that something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice strained. "I keep thinking about what happened, what could have happened." David nodded in understanding, not pushing him, not trying to fix things. "You can't control the past, James, you know that. The only thing you can control is right now, and right now you're here. You're still alive." James exhaled slowly, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The kayak glided silently across the water, the shore of the island gradually getting smaller as they moved farther out. As they paddled, James could feel his heart rate slowly evening out. The panic hadn't disappeared, but it wasn't as overwhelming as it had been. He was still on edge, still tense, but something was shifting. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, there was a sudden movement below the surface of the water. A shadow. A dark shape that cut through the water with terrifying speed. It was large, unmistakable, and it was heading straight for them. James's blood ran cold. His paddle stopped mid-stroke, his breath catching in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively leaned forward, trying to see through the water, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But there was no time to think, no time to process what was happening. "David," he gasped, his voice sharp with panic. "David, look!" David turned to follow his gaze, but before he could react, the water erupted. A massive, dark shape shot up beneath them, slamming into James's kayak with a force that nearly threw him into the water. The kayak flipped violently, and for a moment everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Water surged over him, crashing against his chest as he struggled to right himself. He could hear David yelling, but the words were drowned out by the sound of water rushing around him. Panic surged in his veins as he kicked his legs, desperately trying to regain control of the kayak. But it was no use. The boat was overturned and the water was closing in. And then through the chaos there was a flash of silver. The shark, the same hammerhead, unmistakable with its broad, flat head. It was circling, its eyes locked on James, its massive body, gliding through the water with a predatory grace. James's heart slammed against his ribcage, his body frozen in fear. His hand reached out, but it was too late. The shark darted toward him again, its jaws snapping shut with a terrifying sound. He could feel the pressure of its presence, the weight of the attack even as the water churned around him. "James!" David's voice cut through the panic, and suddenly his hand was there, grabbing onto James's arm, pulling him toward him. "Grab my paddle!" David shouted, but the words barely registered in James's panicked brain. The shark was too close. It was right there, and he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The water was cold, suffocating. With all the strength he had left, James reached out, grabbing onto David's paddle as the shark lunged again, its teeth scraping against the edge of the kayak. He felt the boat lurch as David pulled them both back, their paddles frantically moving in the water. "Go!" David shouted, his voice raw with urgency. James didn't need any more encouragement. They were racing back to shore, the ocean behind them still alive with the echo of the shark's presence. His hands were shaking, his breath ragged, but they were moving. They were alive. By the time they reached the shore, the adrenaline had worn off, and all that was left was the bone-deep exhaustion. James stumbled onto the sand, his body shaking uncontrollably, his heart still thundering in his chest. David collapsed beside him, his face pale, his body trembling with the same terror. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The only sound was the crashing of the waves, distant now, as if the ocean itself had grown tired of its hunt. Finally, James spoke, his voice hoarse. It wasn't a mistake. David turned to look at him, his face grim. No, it wasn't. The water was a blur of motion and terror. Every instinct in James screamed to get out, to swim to shore, but the hammerhead shark was too close. Its massive body circling, its wide, cold eyes fixed on him like a predator with a single goal: to attack. Panic surged through him, and his breathing became shallow, sharp. His muscles were frozen, as though the sheer size and speed of the shark had paralyzed him with fear. David's voice reached him through the chaos, but it felt distant, muffled beneath the roar of the water crashing against his ears. "James, James, grab the kayak, get to the kayak!" James's mind raced as the cold water rushed over his head, pulling him down deeper. He kicked frantically, his limbs heavy with dread, but the shark's movements were unnervingly precise. It was closing in, not yet striking, but circling with a deliberate, menacing grace. This is it, he thought, the finality of the moment sweeping over him. I'm not going to make it. He glanced toward David, who was already scrambling for his own kayak, but the distance between them seemed insurmountable. The kayak had been completely flipped, leaving them both stranded in the open water, vulnerable and exposed. The sound of the shark's body cutting through the water sent another wave of fear through him. His thoughts were jumbled, incoherent. He needed to think, to do something, anything, but the terror was overwhelming. Then, as if in slow motion, the shark made its move. With a surge of power, it lunged toward James, its enormous jaws wide. "Hope and no," James screamed, his voice drowned out by the sound of rushing water. He flailed instinctively, trying to get out of the shark's path, but the animal was too fast, too relentless. The water was thick with bubbles as the shark's teeth snapped just inches from his legs. For a moment, James was sure it had him. His body froze again, a deep instinctual fear taking over. But somehow he managed to pull himself out of range. His heart was hammering in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through him in a way that felt almost surreal. The shark retreated, its cold gaze never leaving him as it circled once more, as if testing his resolve, as if toying with him. "James, we need to get to the shore. Now." David's voice was frantic now, urgent, sharp with panic. But James couldn't move. His body felt weighted down as though every ounce of energy had been drained from him. He was too scared to swim, too scared to do anything but watch as the shark closed in again. A sudden rush of movement, a figure, broke the surface of the water beside him. It was David. He was coming toward him, paddling furiously in the half-submerged kayak, his face a mask of terror but determination. "Grab the kayak, James!" now David shouted. James reached out, his fingers slipping on the slippery surface, but he managed to grip the edge of the kayak. With one last desperate pull, he managed to pull himself up, his chest heaving with relief as his body sank into the boat. For a moment he thought he might pass out, the intensity of the situation overwhelming him, but the shark was still there. It circled again, its eyes never leaving them. Its presence was palpable, suffocating, as if the ocean itself had turned against them. James could feel the weight of its gaze, its every movement seeming to draw him closer to the edge of panic. "Keep paddling," David urged, his voice low, but steady, though his eyes betrayed the fear that had taken root in him too. "Don't stop. Don't look back. We need to get to the shore." James nodded, but his body felt like lead. Every movement was deliberate, forced. He wasn't sure if he could do it. His muscles ached, his breathing ragged, but he pushed forward. Together, they paddled furiously, the kayak cutting through the water in a desperate race toward the shore. The shark followed, shadowing them from below, its sleek, powerful body moving in time with their strokes. It was getting closer again, its dorsal fin just beneath the surface, an ominous, unmistakable sign of its presence. "Come on," David shouted. "We're almost there." But the shore still felt impossibly far away. The water seemed to stretch endlessly before them, and the shark was still there, still pursuing them, its movements deliberate and terrifyingly fast. James's arms burned, his thoughts a blur of panic, but he kept paddling. Each stroke was an act of defiance, a refusal to succumb to the fear that threatened to paralyze him. The shark lunged again. This time, there was no mistaking its intent. It was coming for them, a savage, predatory force, its mouth open wide, its jaws capable of tearing through flesh with a single strike. David saw it first. He shouted something, but it was too late. The shark hit the kayak with a violent force that threw them both off balance. The boat tipped dangerously, and James felt himself thrown into the water once more. Everything went black for a moment, and when he opened his eyes, the cold shock of the ocean hit him like a slap. The shark was there, circling beneath him, and panic surged through his veins again. His body thrashed instinctively, but the cold water sucked him down, threatening to pull him under. "James, hold on!" David's voice rang out above him. He saw David's hand reaching down through the water, but the distance between them was too great. The shark was closing in again, its teeth flashing white in the murky water. It was happening again. James was going to drown, and this time there would be no one to save him. The terror clenched around his chest like a vice, suffocating him. His limbs were numb, his head spinning as he tried to reach out, but his body refused to cooperate. And then, in a moment of sheer desperation, he remembered something he had heard, something that had stuck with him when he had first started guiding tours on the water. Sharks were curious, territorial creatures, but they didn't usually attack unless they felt threatened, unless they felt provoked. It was a sudden thought, a flicker of clarity in the midst of his panic, but it was enough. He stopped thrashing, forcing himself to slow his breathing, to calm his mind. James stilled his body. He floated there, eyes wide, listening to the sound of his heart pounding in his chest. The water was still, too still, and then he saw it. The shark had stopped. It was circling, yes, but more slowly now, as though unsure, hesitant. It was as if it had lost interest, or perhaps as if it had finally determined that there was no immediate threat. David's voice cut through the tension. "James, the shore. We're close. We can make it." Somehow, in that moment, James found the strength to paddle again, slowly at first, then with more confidence as the distance between them and the shore began to close. He felt the surge of relief with each stroke, the terror still gripping him, but the shore was within reach. Finally, with one last push, they reached the shallows. The kayak scraped against the sand, and James collapsed onto the shore, gasping for air, his body shaking uncontrollably. David followed quickly, rolling out of the kayak and pulling himself onto the sand. Both of them lay there for a moment, not speaking, just breathing, just trying to process what had happened. James looked out at the water, his eyes still wide with shock, still unable to believe they had made it. The shark had disappeared into the depths, and the water was calm again, the terror retreating as quickly as it had come. But for James, it wasn't over. It would never be over. The fear, the adrenaline, the sensation of being hunted, it would stay with him, shaping every thought, every movement for a long time to come. He wasn't sure when or if he would ever get back in a kayak again, but for now, the ocean had shown him its true face, and it was one he would never forget.